Hello, I'm Rob,
And I'm Angie. And
and
together,
together
we're
we're
Twinfinity.
Twinfinity.
We are twin flames in union who have been called to start sharing our 20-year journey with you guys through a series of videos. This is our second video. Last week, I did a video sharing a bit about my life and my experiences before Rob and I met. And this time it's his turn. We're doing it this way rather than starting our videos from when we met, just because a lot of our history, a lot of our past, are a bit of a foundation of who we were and also who we were when we connected then. So they affect our life both when we connected, when we separated. So we thought rather than tell those kind of bits of stories as we were kind of sharing our videos of when we met, we thought it would be best to kind of explain our lives a little bit before we even met. So I'm going to let Rob take the floor now, since this is his story, and he can share from his perspective on his life and journey.
A couple of things to clear up before I get started. First of all, we are in our living room. Right over here, just across, is a roof of one of our neighbors' houses, and this is a really low-tech telestrator, but it's about all I have right now. Right where my finger is mountains. We actually get a little bit of a mountain view from our living room. These mountains are about an hour's drive away. And further over, I'm having troubles with this. This is difficult. It's a couple of chimneys, and anything past the pine tree here is all prairies out there. So this is going to be a spot where we're going to be doing our videos from for probably most of the rest of the winter, now that it's starting to get too cold to be outside. Point number two, this is actually take two of our video today of me and my story. We went out to the mountains again, and we went to a place called Two Jack Lake, and we got ourselves all set up on a couple of nice rocks right beside the water. In fact, one of the rocks actually is just right, I'm talking wet from the water.
And it's beautiful out there.
Some tall mountains in the background, and we went ahead and did my story and came home and we're reviewing it just to make sure everything okay, and everything was not okay. There was just a little bit too much wind. It crackled through the microphone too often, lost too much of what I was saying, and now we're, I'm going to say sadly, but still excitedly, on take two. So getting into the story.
This is where I'll exit. I'm going to just sit over here on the wall so I can be close by, but I'll let Rob take the floor. So bye for now.
I was born on August 2nd, 1964. Again, doing the math, just like Angie did last weekend, that makes me 53 years old. I'm 10 years older than Angie. I was born in a place called Lloydminster. It's right on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border between the two provinces here in Canada. And the hospital is on the Saskatchewan side of the border. So therefore, my birth certificate says province of Saskatchewan. I've never lived in Saskatchewan. I've always lived in Alberta. My mom and dad, first of all, my dad was a truck driver. I say that loosely because he was a professional driver. He didn't always drive trucks, but my mom was a farm girl, tough as nails type farm girl, and very, very down to earth. She grew up in a very poor family, but nonetheless, I came along, and I never did have any other siblings. I'm an only child. Medical technology would look after reasons why I'm an only child. Mom and Dad decided it just wasn't worth it to try for another child. So there I was, an only child. When I was 2 years old, I had one of the more major events that define kind of who I am. It's amazing how this starts out at such a young age. I grabbed my grandmother, who was holding me, by her front shirt collar. I was trying to express what I wanted. I was very, very demanding. I couldn't speak well enough to really express what I wanted. And she apparently called me Bossy Boots. And I apparently still carry some of that characteristic nowadays, right? I try and kind of get what I want, or at least I try to ask for it strongly.
Yes, and if I can interject from the side here, it was actually not long after Rob and I got into union, almost 3 years ago, that I actually called him Bossy Boots once without even knowing this whole little story about his childhood. So it's kind of funny that that was a nickname for him growing up.
Or his baby, anyway.
My dad and his brother and their two cousins had inherited a trucking company from their parents, and that was that was the foundation of the income for the family. My mom did not work at a job once I was born. She'd worked a couple of odd jobs before that, but we spent a lot of time moving back and forth between Lloydminster, where I was born, and Edmonton, which was at that time a couple hours to the west. When I was 5 years old, we were living in Edmonton, and being an only child, I did a lot of what mom and dad did. And my dad was very much into model airplanes. Now, they weren't model airplanes like they are nowadays. Model airplanes nowadays are remote control. They zip all over the sky just like a normal airplane. Back then, radio controlled model airplanes barely existed. They were all on what we called control lines. Basically, they were on kite strings, and you just flew around in circles. They were 60-foot diameter circle. And yeah, you'd have two or three people flying their airplanes at the same time. There'd be little dog fights up there. Once in a while, people get their lines tangled up and the planes go crashing into the ground. You can easily see why remote control came on. It was crazy what it was done. But here I was, a 5-year-old kid, flying my own airplane with the adults from the circle, zipping around with them. And once in a while, they would have competitions. And just because I was 5 years old and I could fly a model airplane all by myself without help, I would win trophies. I was in the adult world. I never owned a G.I. Joe. That's one thing I have to say. Never did. I lived as an adult from a very, very young age. Without any siblings, I didn't have a lot of contact with kids my age, maybe somebody next door, or when I went to kindergarten or when I got started in school, then I started to associate with kids more my age. But still, the majority of my time and my communication was with my mom and dad and their friends. And a lot of their friends didn't have kids my age either. It was just one of those things where I was an adult long before I grew up to be an adult. At age 7, we'd moved back to Lloydminster, and there was trouble within the trucking company. It was a privately owned company. It was run as a private enterprise without any other influence, but the drivers decided there was many trucks and trailers on the road. I think there was upwards of 50 to 52 trucks and trailers under the one name. The drivers decided they wanted to go unionized, and management, my dad and his siblings, they did not want that to happen, and things got a little bit rough. There was a few union tactics and a few management tactics that were not safe. So my mom and I were moved to St. Albert, which is a suburb just north of Edmonton. It used to be separated by a bit, but now they're places right side by side. And about 6 to 8 months later, my dad joined us. The company was sold off to another company that the drivers were more happy with, and unfortunately, my dad had to go ahead and start to work a life outside of being a business owner. One thing he did, though, is instead of working long haul and spending many, many, many hours a day at work, to be with Mom and I, he took an 8-hour-a-day job, which turned out to be very, very beneficial. We would play games at night instead of just Mom and I being there because Dad was working 16 hours a day or he was on a long haul. So he was around a lot more after the transport company folded. One major problem that I had, though, was moving from Lloydminster, oil town, blue collar. All the guys had brush cuts, and this is in the early 70s. We moved to St. Albert where it was white collar. It was a high-end suburb, although we lived in an older section. That's all we could really afford to live in. The kids there were doctors' kids, and they were dentists' kids, and they were accountants' kids, and politicians' kids. And having come from little oil town, I did not fit in at all. It was a huge struggle. there was a lot of conflict between me and my classmates. It was it was quite bad. I would get in fights often on the way to school or during recess. There would there was always name calling because I was the only one that wearing short hair, and I didn't realize there was a different world out there because I'd only known the world of blue collar existence. So I became very unhappy. It was grade four. This is a little bit of a tough story to tell, but I really rebelled. I once went into the washroom of the school, which is where I had to meet all these kids that were giving me a hard time because I was the way I was and I didn't fit in. I went into the bathroom, I took out a roll of paper off the roll and I strung it up all over the walls and close to the roof, and I took a pack of matches out of my pocket and I lit this toilet paper on fire because I was going to burn down the school. I'd had enough. I didn't want to be anywhere near this people, and that was the best way to not have to go to school is if I got rid of it. Plan didn't work. Toilet paper burned, but that was it. Nothing else caught fire. Yeah, probably, thank goodness it didn't. That's the thinking of a 9, 10-year-old. But I got in a lot of trouble for that, and it kind of worked in the opposite of what I really was looking to do. The school didn't have a lot of kids. It had about 250, maybe 300 kids. And so I was put in the classroom with all the trouble kids, the ones that required special attention. So I ended up in a classroom with the very kids that were bullying me that made me so angry that I wanted to burn down the school. It was just totally didn't work for me at all. So I spent a couple of years with lots of extra help and whatnot, and they eventually figured out I wasn't a violent kid. I was just struggling. And I'd started to develop my own framework of friends anyway. Other kids that were not necessarily mainstream, a couple of them, well, actually one for sure, my closest friend for many years. His dad was also a truck driver, so we got along quite well. I eventually started to fit in with my own people, and those struggles soon disappeared into my past. My dad was very involved in the Boy Scout movement. He had the time to do that once he stopped doing long haul trucking and whatnot. So I was also in Cubs and Scouts as I got a little bit older. But one other thing that happened, though, is my dad and his uncle, no, my dad and my uncle, got into jet boats. Now, I realize not a lot of people know what jet boats are. I'm going to keep this real simple. Basically, they don't have a propeller underneath them to move them along. They suck up water into what I call a jet pump, and they squirt it out the back like a fire hose, and essentially a lot of water going one direction pushes the boat the other. It causes us to be able to run in very, very shallow water, 3-4 inches of water, which allowed us to travel on a lot of the smaller rivers that are in existence in this part of the world. And that was a ton of fun. It's something that the Boy Scouts could get together with, and they put 2 or 3 boats together, and we'd go out and play on the rivers. But it was also one of my first introductions to nature that I got week after week, because we did this week after week. I spent a lot of time and hours on rivers, and I learned to drive boats at a very young age. You wouldn't let kids who are 11 years old drive their own boat with anywhere from 60 to 300 horsepower engine on the back. But because I'd been an adult for so long and I didn't know any different, I got in and I drove the boats quite competently, and it got to the point where nobody would watch me do this. They would just be in the boat with me, and I would navigate around rocks and around islands and everything else, no problem. But that just continued to contribute to me not necessarily adapting in, because other kids weren't doing that. I was doing that. In early high school became important because it would set a person up for the rest of their life. You know, you can skate through the elementary and intermediate schools, but high school, you got to pay attention. And I had lots of distractions. With the jet boating, my dad had got more serious, and we started to race jet boats. So we would build boats. I would get off school and I would hurry home, and we would build hulls. We would build engines. The rest of the world wasn't really doing that, but it was a fantastic education. We would go out and tour all over Western Canada and sometimes Northwest United States, chasing the jet boat races, competing at the whatever level we could in our various classifications. At the age of 14, I drove. I wasn't a passenger. These jet boats had three-person crews. I was driver in the World Championships when the circuit came through Western Canada on the Smoky River. So that's how much I had grown up at a very young age. One thing about water, I learned to appreciate rivers and nature and water and I call it the force of nature, but also the beauty of nature. How it would carve, like water would carve around an island and make a fantastic little channel. Sometimes, tearing out a bunch of trees. It was really quite eye-opening for me as a young kid to realize that water is what sculpted the earth. There's air, there's water. It's a very major factor. And I started to pay attention to how the earth operated. And I was lucky to choose water to begin with because it's one of the most major forces that there is on the whole planet. I came out of high school in 4 years, not 3 years, because the jet boat racing and other minor distractions like getting a driver's license and hanging out with my friends, I wasn't in a hurry to finish high school. I was in a hurry to get out early and continue on with the jet boat racing. So I finished my high school in 4 years. And when I got out of high school after my 4th year, I thought, great, now I'm ready to challenge the world. I've done lots of different things. And I had my first real dose of disappointment when I went over to the local university and I decided I'd want to go into meteorology, study weather. Hey, we got a neighbor out there. Hi, neighbor. Bye, neighbor. I decided I wanted to study meteorology. I went over to the university and they basically skidded me right back off of campus. I didn't have that good of marks. I didn't have anything that would really get me into university. And I learned that in a very short conversation. I went to a technical school that had a biological sciences program. It was a 2-year program, and I was very excited to go into that with the thought that I loved nature and I liked trees. I understood it quite a bit. I thought that I could knock that course pretty much dead. Well, some of the same struggles that I'd had in school also cropped up there. So after a year and a half, I wasn't failing from a point of view of not passing the marks, but I was in the 20% of the lowest achievers in the course. So I got culled out of the program, which hurt my feelings. But while I was in the program, I had also met the person that would become my first wife. She was taking dental assisting, and I was in that bio-sci program. And we met at a party, a town hall kind of party, where the two groups were having a Saturday night. I was working security because I wasn't much of a partier, and she was working the bar because she wasn't much of a partier, but she knew how to mix the odd drink. And we ended up at the same place at the same time and got to know each other and discovered that we liked a lot of the same things. I had discovered athletics, being a couch potato when I was a kid and getting into jet boat racing. I discovered athletics, football, baseball. We both played baseball. We both liked to hike. So we hit it off really well, and on July 5th, 1986, we got married. That marriage lasted 7 years. It was, for the most part, a good 7 years, but we had got married young. I was 21 when I got married, and she was younger than I was. And about halfway through our 7-year marriage, she decided that she would like to have a family. And I was deciding that I wanted to be more athletic and more free-spirited, and I wanted nothing to do with having a family. And that riff really tore us apart. She was very, very depressed. The usual symptoms, lack of motivation, putting on weight, that didn't bother me. but the thought that she was just an emotional wreck over a decision that I was making and I wasn't backing down from because I didn't want kids, uh, it tore me apart. And so, at about the 7 year mark of that marriage, we called it quits. I had insisted more than she did, but we did call it quits. And that put me on the next phase of my life. I was 28 years old. I had eventually settled into a career of being a partsman. I was working in automotives, and I had accelerated quite well through the learning curves, and I was looking to take on new challenges. I had become Edmonton's one and only first Lexus parts specialist. Lexus had come along in early 1990, and I was good with people. So I was the chosen one to do that, and I really enjoyed that. But I wanted something more. And I heard through the grapevine that there was a potential management job in my car brand, which was primarily still Toyota, down here in Calgary. So I heard about that on a Friday afternoon. I went into work on Monday and I told my boss, hey, I'm going to be away Wednesday and Thursday, to go for an interview down in Calgary. Now, my boss was not very happy with that. Of course he wasn't. But nonetheless, I said I was going to Calgary for those 2 days, and I kind of said it in a way where I didn't give him much of an option other than to say, yes, good luck. So Wednesday, I came down to Calgary. I did an interview in the morning, and the person I did the interview with, who was the general manager, he was happy with what he saw. So we went out for lunch with two of the owners of the business, and during that lunch, one of the owners mentioned that he liked fishing. Now, I was into extreme athletics. I was riding bikes like crazy. I'd ride for miles and miles and miles. And I said right there at the table, you know, fishing and golf are the world's two most well-developed wastes of time. And I said that very heartfeltly. And 3 or 4 seconds later, I realized that all I'd done is just insulted the guy. I guess I didn't insult him very much, because after the interview, went to a hotel room, slept overnight, got up the next morning, got back on the phone with these people, and they said, yeah, okay, we're going to hire you as our parts manager. So I'd got what I wanted, but I was in Calgary, and it had only been 6 days since I heard about the job. I needed a place to live. Now, when I lived in Edmonton, I lived in a high-rise building, 17 stories up, facing west. I loved the view. I liked being able to see out. So I went to the west edge of downtown Calgary to look for a place to live. And there was this tall apartment building. I looked at it, looked way up to the top, counted the amount of floors. It was 37 stories tall. I went into the rental office and I said, hey, do you have an apartment on the west side of that building, high up? Do you have anything? And they said, yeah, we do. We got an apartment on the 36th floor. Is that high enough for you? And of course, yeah, of course it was. It was only one floor below the top. I actually couldn't have the top floor. The top floor was penthouses, so they were just playing with me a little bit. But I got exactly what I wanted. A 2-bedroom apartment, facing west, high up, first building I went to. It was just that easy. So I went up, looked at the apartment, 5 or 10 minutes. Didn't matter. I wanted it. That's where I was going to live. Went downstairs, signed the papers, got ready to make my trip back up to Edmonton, phoned my boss. Now this is a Thursday afternoon. Phoned my boss and I said I'd be in for my Friday and Saturday shift and nothing else. I'd committed to going to work the next Monday down in Calgary. So now I'd given him 2 days notice I was going to be away for 2 days looking for a job. Now I was giving him 2 days notice that I was actually leaving the job that I had. I really feel sorry for those people. They looked after me for like 4 or 5 years as I was learning how to be a parts guy, and then I ditched them. That wasn't very nice of me. But nonetheless, I was excited, and it was my new life. I was getting out of Edmonton where I had a past. I was getting closer to the mountains, which I'd already started to enjoy through all the hiking. Edmonton's further away from the mountains. It takes 3 hours to drive to the mountains from Edmonton. It takes just over an hour from Calgary. Perfect fit. So, worked my Friday, worked my Saturday. already contacted a U-Haul place to get a moving truck. Met my mom and dad. We moved me out Saturday night. Drove me to Calgary Sunday morning. Threw me into my apartment. Mom and dad got back in the U-Haul and drove it back up to Edmonton. It's Sunday night. I'm a Calgarian. Monday morning, went to work. Didn't know much about management. Knew lots about being a parts guy, but didn't know much about management. So I ended up working a ton of hours. That's actually never ended. But I ended up working a ton of hours, and I got to play on the weekends. Once in a while, I'd get off work early and go ride my bike and learn a little bit more about Calgary. But it was on the weekends that I would drive out to the mountains, usually Sundays because I was still working Saturdays. And I started to hike in the mountains around here. I would hike for 4 hours, or 6 hours, or 8 hours, even sometimes long hikes, 10 hours. But I didn't know anybody, so I was out there by myself. Not supposed to go hiking by yourself. There's bears and other critters, big cats. Didn't really care. Didn't really maybe even know better. But I would go out hiking, and being by myself for most of that time, other than the odd person that I ran into out there that was also hiking, I got to do a lot of thinking. I got to hike by lots of water. I was in the trees unless I got up above the tree line. And that really, really opened up my spirit and my soul. The foundation that I'd got from all the years of enjoying water and being amazed at how it worked on the planet progressed and grew rapidly as I spent more and more time in nature. And it was really quite a spiritual awakening for me. It got me started on a direction that I'd never really practiced deeply before. And I'd get involved in conversations with other people. Man, it's amazing how you put your foot to sleep when you're sitting on it. Excuse me one moment, I'll be back to the story. By the way, if you hear it crunching back there, we have a small dog. It's chewing on a bone. Don't know if you'll be able to hear that. You'll meet Cookie sometime.
You'll meet her sometime, yeah.
Anyway, me telling my story without being able to feel a foot, I really, really got involved with other people who would talk spirituality. I met a couple of people at work. One of them became a regular hiking partner of mine. I wasn't on my own forever. I eventually did make friends down here too. And when I was on my own, I would connect with spirit as best as I could. When I was out hiking with other people, we would talk philosophy and meaning of life. And it really became a very, very intense time of growth. I became very self-aware of what was important to me. And also, I found a book. Now, my book was a lot simpler than Angie's book that she had found that she mentioned in her last video. My book was called Scrambles in the Canadian Rockies. A scramble is sort of a technical term. Technical climbers that are using ropes to climb mountains will sometimes climb up to the summit of a mountain using the hard way and walk off the easy way on a mountain, if it has one, to get back down to their vehicles and eventually go home. A scramble is the hike up the easy way that the technical climbers use to go down sometimes. So I would scramble, using notes from the guidebook, I would scramble to the top of different mountains nearly every week. And to see the world, big rivers be tiny rivers from the top of mile-tall mountains. To see the world from up there almost every week just added fuel to my fire of loving the world, being in touch with nature. I even started to feel that some mountains had attitude. Some mountains were friendly. They'd be like, hey, come play on me. I've got rocks to climb on and easy stuff. And other mountains, you'd be climbing on the rocks and they would always break loose and they'd be nasty to you. Some mountains had attitude, even though they looked no different than the mountain right beside them. There'd be times I'd be driving through the mountains and I'd be chatting with them. I know that sounds weird, but hi mountain, hi other mountain. Yeah, I'm not going to go anywhere near you today. You've got a big cloud on top of you. You look like you've got attitude. It became a time where I really did connect with nature. I spent 3 years doing that, and I had the odd relationship along the way. I've had three Angela, Angelinas in my life, and I met uh, Angela along the way, and she was a girlfriend for a relatively short amount of time, but she was also a very spiritual person, and I had learned a lot from her. She introduced me to a bunch of words that would be household words to us now, but it was stuff I'd never heard of before. Words like chakras was one, and auras was another. She was very good at this kind of stuff, and I learned a lot. It was just a massive time of learning. Now, at this point, I'm 3 years in Calgary, and I don't know it, but I'm just about ready to meet Angie. So this is about where the story catches up with itself from a point of view of being at the same point that Angie described in her video last week. I've described enough of what happened to me in my youth and where I'd started to grow and where I was at. I was at a very happy time. I was working hard, I was playing hard, and I was 10 years past, 10, 11, 12 years past the end of high school or any post-secondary. I'd learned a lot in life for a person who had only been on the planet roughly 31, 32 years.
So I'm going to come back in now. And as you can see, our mountains are all gone, and now you just see the reflection of our house in the background.
It's dark. There's mountains out there.
Sadly, they are there. So anyway, as you can see from our different stories, if you watched my video last week, there's a lot of differences between our stories, but yet there's actually some similarities. Differences, household we grew up in, very different. He had a very calm growing up childhood with his parents. I did not. But yet in school, we both still struggled for different reasons. You know, he was bullied. I was just shy because I had all this other trauma going on. And interestingly enough, another difference is I did well academically. He did not do so well academically. Yet, on the flip side, the practical parts of life were very hard for me. Practical part of nursing I struggled with. Yet the practical part of life he excelled in. So a lot of similarities, but a lot of opposites as well. Also, interestingly enough, we both grew up in Edmonton or Edmonton area in Alberta, Canada, and yet never met, never knew each other, had no idea we even existed to the other person, and then both very quickly moved to Calgary later in our adult lives.
Both of us on a whim. She was in a hurry to move to Calgary. I was in a hurry.
And then ended up in the same apartment building. Both of us, the only building we went into, the only building we inquired about renting, and then we end up in the same building, in the same city, moved from the same city. Kind of interesting. And also our connection with the mountains. We both wanted a west-facing apartment. For me, it wasn't about mountains at the time because I hadn't even thought of mountains. I was just thinking sunsets. But we both had a lot of similarities in our draw of why we picked that apartment building. We wanted west-facing. We wanted the end of downtown so we could see the sunsets. So fascinating, really, even for us to, share our stories and go, wow, like there's some neat differences and similarities. It's really kind of cool. So again, it was just important for us to share a bit about our lives. So once we start talking about how we met and then later how we ended up breaking up, going through the separation, it would start to make sense why things clicked, but then why they didn't click, why we worked and then why we didn't work.
It's very hard to tell a life story or the first portion of a life story and remember everything. So we're going to be referring back to this every so often. And there's even going to be some additional bits that'll come out. I'm thinking of 3 or 4 anyway. Some of them fantastic, some of them a little bit exposing, but it's all part of the journey. Everything, nearly everything that was major also mattered.
Exactly.
So at this point, we're going to let this trail off. We're going to give it another probably close to a week, and we're going to get into the story of the actual day we met.
I know this is the part you guys have been waiting for, so next video will be how we met, our magical day together, our mountains that are obviously a passion for both of us separately, and how they became such a big part of our lives jointly. So we look forward to our next video with you guys, because it'll be really exciting to start sharing the exciting love stuff.
Totally for us too.
Yes.
She kept journals. I've just got my memories. I'm going to have to read her journals, because there's some things in there that I don't quite remember the same, but then again, that was a long time ago.
Yes. Yeah. We'll catch up on those beforehand so we can share our story. So we're going to leave you now. Just one last thought. Always remember to connect with your twin, go within. And for now, we will say good night.
Good night.